They built a nation that rarely remembered their names. Not the presidents carved into mountains, not the generals immortalized in bronze, but the hands, calloused, invisible, relentless, that turned wilderness into a republic. This is not just American history. This is the story of the people history tried to forget. Chapter 1. Before the nation had a name. Long before there was a United States, before the ink dried on declarations or the thunder of revolution shook the Atlantic coast, there existed a vast, breathing world. Forests stretched endlessly across the eastern seaboard, dense and alive. Rivers carved their own languages into the earth. The land was not empty, as later settlers would claim. It was inhabited, understood, and deeply respected. Indigenous nations thrived here, each with its own systems, cultures, economies, and beliefs. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy governed through sophisticated political alliances. The Powhatan chiefdom managed complex agricultural and trade systems. The Cherokee adapted and evolved with remarkable resilience. To them, land was not a commodity. It was identity. Then came the ships. Not all at once, but enough. At first, they were whispers on the horizon, strange sails, floating wood, unknown intentions. Then, they became something else. A beginning. Chapter 2. The First Collisions. The early encounters were not immediately violent. There was curiosity, trade, misunderstanding. Metal tools exchanged for food, words exchanged without shared meaning, gestures that meant peace on one side and confusion on the other. But beneath the surface, something irreversible had begun. Disease moved faster than diplomacy. Smallpox, influenza, measles, silent invaders. Entire communities were reshaped before they even understood what was happening. Villages that had stood for generations were suddenly hollowed out. For European settlers, survival was fragile, but expansion was inevitable. For indigenous nations, survival became real.
Chapter 3. Colonies of Hope and Hunger. Jamestown was not the beginning of glory. It was the beginning of desperation. Settlers arrived with dreams of wealth, but found themselves unprepared for the brutal reality of the New World. Starvation, conflict, and internal chaos defined the early years. They were not heroes yet. They were survivors. Tobacco changed everything. What began as an experiment became an economic engine. Land was cleared. Labor was demanded. Systems were created, not just to grow crops, but to sustain expansion. And with that came one of the most defining contradictions of American history. Freedom built alongside unfreedom.
Chapter 4. The Unseen Foundation. By the late 1600s, a system had taken root. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't temporary. It was engineered. Enslaved Africans were brought into the colonies, not just as laborers, but as the foundation of an economic structure that would define generations. Their identities were stripped, their histories fractured, but their labor built the wealth that colonies depended on. Plantations expanded, trade networks grew, and a brutal hierarchy solidified. Yet even within oppression, there was resistance. Not always loud, not always visible, but constant. Songs carried coded messages. Families held on to fragments of culture. Small acts, learning to read, escaping, refusing, became quiet rebellions. The nation was forming, but not equally. Chapter 5. The Idea of America. By the 18th century, something new was emerging. Not just colonies, but identity.
people began to ask dangerous questions. What is power? Who deserves it? And who decides? The British Crown saw colonies as assets, resources, extensions of authority. But colonists began to see themselves differently. Not as subjects, but as something else. Something unfinished.
Part 2. The Fire That Asked Dangerous Questions. Chapter 6. The Cost of Belonging. The British Empire did not see the colonies as partners. It saw them as investments. After the 7 Years' War, Britain stood victorious, but deeply in debt. The war had expanded its territory across North America, pushing French influence out and redrawing maps that most colonists had never seen. Victory came with a price, and the Crown expected the colonies to pay it. The Stamp Act was not just a tax, it was a statement. Printed materials, legal documents, newspapers, all required official stamps purchased from British authorities. To London, it was reasonable. To the colonists, it was something else entirely. An intrusion, a precedent, a warning. Chapter 7. Voices Without Representation. The phrase didn't begin as a slogan. It began as frustration. No taxation without representation. It echoed through taverns, meeting halls, and crowded streets. Not as rebellion yet, but as protest. Colonists weren't rejecting authority outright. They were challenging its legitimacy. Men like Samuel Adams understood something critical. Ideas could spread faster than armies. Committees formed, pamphlets circulated, boycotts took hold. And slowly, resistance transformed from scattered discontent into organized defiance. The Crown responded not with compromise, but with control. Troops arrived in cities like Boston, not as protectors, but as reminders. Chapter 8. When Tension Turned to Blood. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. March 5th, 1770. A confrontation between colonists and British soldiers spiraled into chaos. Snowballs turned to stones. Shouting turned to gunfire. 5 colonists lay dead. The Boston Massacre became something larger than the event itself. It became a symbol. To the British, it was self-defense. To the colonists, it was proof. Proof that power, unchecked, would always turn violent. And symbols, unlike facts, have a way of spreading faster. Chapter 9. The Spark in the Harbor. By 1773, the conflict had shifted. It wasn't just about taxes anymore. It was about control. The Tea Act attempted to rescue a struggling company by allowing it to sell tea directly to the colonies, cheaply, but with a hidden cost. Acceptance. If colonists bought the tea, they accepted Parliament's right to tax them. That was the real price. So on a cold December night, men disguised themselves. Not perfectly, not convincingly, but symbolically. They boarded ships. They broke open crates. They threw tea into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party was not just destruction of property. It was a declaration. Not written in ink, but in action.
Chapter 10. The Point of No Return. Britain did not misunderstand the message. It responded with force. The intolerable acts were designed to punish, isolate, and control Massachusetts. Boston's port was closed. Self-governance was stripped away. But something unexpected happened. The colonies didn't fracture. They united.
Delegates gathered, not as subjects, but as representatives. The First Continental Congress marked a shift in thinking. Colonies began to see themselves not as separate entities, but as part of something larger, something shared, something fragile, something worth defending. Chapter 11. The Shot Heard Beyond a Continent. April 1775. The tension finally broke. In the quiet towns of Lexington and Concord, British troops marched to seize colonial weapons. They expected resistance. They did not expect what came next. Militia stood their ground. A shot was fired. No one knows who pulled the trigger, but it didn't matter. The battles of Lexington and Concord had begun, and with it, a war that neither side could easily end.
Chapter 12. The Birth of an Idea. War creates urgency, but ideas create nations. In 1776, a document emerged, not just as a political statement, but as a philosophical challenge to the world. Drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence did something radical. It claimed that power did not come from kings. It came from people. All men are created equal. The words were powerful, but they were also incomplete. Because even as they were written, thousands remained enslaved. Women were excluded. Indigenous nations were ignored. The idea of America had been born, but it was not yet honest. Chapter 13. A War of Uncertainty. The Revolution was not a guaranteed victory. Far from it. The British Army was the most powerful military force in the world. The colonies had no unified command, limited resources, and uncertain loyalty. Enter George Washington. He was not the most experienced general, but he understood something more important: endurance. The Continental Army lost battles. It struggled through winters like Valley Forge, where hunger and disease threatened to destroy it from within. Yet it survived. Not because it was stronger, but because it refused to disappear.
Chapter 14. Turning the Tide. Wars are rarely decided in a single moment, but some moments matter more than others. The victory at Battle of Saratoga changed everything. It convinced France that the colonies were not a lost cause. Support arrived: troops, ships, resources. The war was no longer a rebellion. It had become international. And Britain, stretched across global conflicts, began to feel pressure from all sides. Chapter 15. The End and the Beginning. At Yorktown, British General Charles Cornwallis found himself surrounded. American forces, French allies, no escape. The surrender at the Siege of Yorktown effectively ended the war. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris formally recognized the United States as an independent nation. It was over. But also, it had just begun. Chapter 16. The Fragile Experiment. Winning independence was one thing. Building a nation was another. The United States was not born stable. It was born uncertain. The Articles of Confederation created a loose alliance of states, but lacked the power to govern effectively. There was no strong central authority, no reliable system of taxation, no unified direction. Freedom had been won, but order had not. And without order, freedom itself could fracture. Chapter 17. The question that would not go away. What is America supposed to be? It was no longer a question whispered in rebellion. It was now a question written into law. Debates intensified. How strong should the federal government be?
Who should hold power? What rights should be guaranteed? And beneath all of it, unresolved, unavoidable, slavery. The contradiction remained, and it would not stay buried forever.